The University of New Mexico has a new president. Garnett Stokes is the first woman to serve in the highest leadership role at UNM. Ms. Stokes previously served in leadership roles at the University of Missouri and at Florida State University. She arrived in the midst of an investigation into the finances of the athletics department and other challenges at the university. President Stokes sat down this week with our correspondent Megan Kamerick to talk about how she plans to address these issues and the tone she aims to set at the state's largest university.
UNM President Garnett Stokes, thank you for joining us this week.
Really happy to be here. Thank you.
What tone are you aiming to set as president of UNM?
I would say what I'd really want to do as university president is set a tone for transparency, for inclusiveness, for accountability. I think that those are important issues for the public in thinking about the University of New Mexico.
Are there other or past experiences, maybe in another university, that shaped who you are today as the president of the University of New Mexico?
Well, I've been in higher education administration for a number of years, so I've seen a lot. I would say certainly my experiences as provost and interim president at Florida State and provost and then also interim chancellor at Missouri certainly have shaped the way I think about institutional leadership and the role of public research universities in their states. I think that I certainly learned at Missouri the importance of understanding the state that we lived in and the importance of developing relationships across the state. Because inevitably when there are issues that arise, you have to count on the public's trust in what you're doing as an institution to really weather some of those storms. And that's an experience that I bring with me to the University of New Mexico.
Well, speaking of storms, last year, Governor Susana Martinez vetoed all higher education funding for New Mexico over a dispute she had with lawmakers. What is your experience navigating state government?
Well, I had probably some really important experience at Florida State University. We were in the capital city right there with the state legislature. And my president at the time, we were working with the state legislature to get some legislation passed that named the Florida State University a preeminent university. So that was an important experience for me in working in state government. In Missouri, we worked directly with legislators and with the governor's office on a number of initiatives. So plenty of experience.
If you had been UNM president at that time last year, how would you have reached out to the governor and to lawmakers?
At the time of the veto? Well, I think that certainly if I were serving as president at that time, I would have already been talking to legislators and the governor's office. And I think the administration at the University of New Mexico has maintained a lot of ties with all of state government. Certainly there would have been a lot of discussion about what was going on, what was the purpose of deciding to veto all of higher education funding. I know that there were significant reactions to the governor's decision to do that. I don't think that, I think that it can get very political in many states when one is dealing with difficult budget situations, and higher education is sometimes caught in that.
The athletics department at UNM remains under investigation. There are still questions about how public money was managed in the department.
Yes.
You inherited the situation.
Yes.
What are your priorities for addressing transparency and financial management in the athletics department?
Well, I think that you can see that we've already begun putting out a lot more information that I think that more than has ever been made available, I think, to the public about the costs for expenses associated with different sports. I think that we're working really hard to make sure that we get the athletics budget in order. And I think what's really critical is that we provide as much information as we can, that we are clear about the ways in which we make decisions. And I think that we've got a lot of work ahead of us. We have a recurring budget deficit in athletics that we're going to have to make some really difficult decisions to be able to get rid of that deficit. So what I think you'll see in the weeks ahead is that we began publicly discussing, and we already have to some extent, the criteria that we'll use in thinking about the tough decisions that we'll have to make going forward.
As you mentioned, the Director of Athletics recently presented a detailed snapshot on how much it costs to run each of the university's varsity sports. What additional steps will you take to ensure the department is more transparent, both to UNM leaders and to the Attorney General's office?
Well, I think for one thing, we've got an athletics director who is equally committed to transparency. So I think what we're already seeing, we have a CFO in athletics working with us now. And we are making regular reports to our Board of Regents about what we're doing in athletics. So, we'll be making, I think it's really just a strategy that we'll have across the entire institution to make as much information as possible available to the public on issues that are of concern to them.
What about with the Attorney General's office?
So the Attorney General and I think we had a very good meeting recently. I've committed to making sure that I keep him informed on issues. I think no person in a public who's a public figure likes to be blindsided by things that they believe they should have known about in advance. And so I'm committed as much as possible to making sure that I keep the relevant parties informed about things that are going on our campus.
Do you think there's an issue with culture inside the department that needs to be addressed?
Which department?
In the athletics department.
In athletics?
Mm-hmm.
I can't speak too much to the culture that may have existed before. What I know at this time is that there's leadership in athletics that is committed to doing the right thing, to being good representatives of the University of New Mexico. I think there's a real commitment to making sure that what they do, that they're part of the whole, and that really every major office at the university is a reflection of all of us. So there's a desire to bring, to positively reflect on what it is we do at the university.
There's been a bit of turmoil, internal turmoil of late with the Board of Regents at UNM. In fact, recess appointee Alex Romero actually resigned his seat in February, in part because of a difference of opinion over how to set priorities for the university. Were you aware of the internal strife before you took the job, and what is your basic approach to dealing with the regents?
Well, I think that I certainly came into the position knowing that there were concerns about governance at University of New Mexico. It was really important to me to know that I had the support of the entire board when I made the decision to accept the offer for the presidency. So I certainly came in eyes wide open. I think that the regents are committed to doing the right thing for the university. There may be differences of opinion about what that is and how it's done. But basically what I'm doing is working with the board members to try to advance, the various agendas that we have.
You're the first woman to head the university, to be the president. What does that mean in terms of, what does it mean to you, and how does it impact how you do your job?
Well, I've told many people that I've been the first woman in several positions that I've held, and so it's not an unusual situation for me. I was the first female that was elected as department head of psychology at the University of Georgia. I was the first female dean of arts and sciences at Georgia. I was the first female provost at Florida State. So it's not an unusual thing. But I know here in New Mexico, and for those who love the university, this is a very big deal for them. I have never had so many people come up to me, in public settings, more privately, and just tell me how happy they are to see that after 129 years, the University of New Mexico has a woman leader. So I think it sends a very positive message to women and girls in the state. Very positive message to our students, our staff, and our faculty who do believe in their hearts that women may approach decision making, approach issues of climate perhaps with a different set of experiences and through a different lens. And so what's really important to me is that I meet the high expectations that have been set as the first woman in this presidency.
New Mexico is a majority Latino state. Nearly half of the students at UNM are Hispanic or Latino. What will you do to ensure that Latino and Hispanic students are supported at the university?
Well, we have a lot of different groups of people on our campus, and for me, what's really important is that we acknowledge and recognize the many different experiences of our students. And so I will very strongly support our Hispanic and Latinx students. I think that I attended a lot of different graduation ceremonies, recognizing the importance of belonging in one's culture. I believe in inclusive environments in which we respect our individual experiences and our cultural differences. So I'll be working to support, the wide range of students that exist on our campus.
One of the measures of success for universities is the four-year graduation rate. First, what does that number tell you as a university leader?
Well, it tells me the extent to which we are helping our students stay on track, those who are full-time, helping the students stay on track to actually complete their degrees. So that's a really important metric for universities to pay attention to, because the longer students are in school, the more debt they're likely to acquire in the course of completing a degree. And our goal is to get our students, to finish in a timely fashion. We want them to, as quickly as possible, be able to get out and do the next thing, whether it's going to graduate school or whether it's entering the world of work. Sometimes those students are not going to finish in 4 years. A lot of our students are not necessarily full-time, but it's just one metric to examine. Are we really making sure that we're meeting the needs of our students so that they can finish?
What other metrics could we look at to make sure that's happening?
So we often look at 5- and 6-year graduation rates as well. So it's not just the 4-year graduation rate. We often look at retention into the second year. So when we bring students in, what we're really committed to is their success. And the concern with losing students after 1 year is did we actually create the kind of climate where they could feel at home on our campus and feel like they could be successful? So first year retention or retention into the second year is a common metric. I also think that it's going to be important for us to track student success post-graduation, that we want to see that our students are in fact successful once they leave. And so increasingly, I think you'll see us focusing on the extent to which our students are successfully getting into graduate school, successfully getting into the world of work, and being able to do something with the degrees that they've earned. And I'm not one of those who, I really see the value of degrees such as the English degree, the history degree, some humanities degrees that some people will dismiss as not really directly related to a career. But I think that, we want to track the success of students no matter what their area of study is.
New Mexico, as you know, has a unique history and culture. It's not uncommon to hear folks say that everything here is different and things that worked in another state won't work here. Yes. What do you plan to say to convince people to consider solutions from other places?
oh, I hadn't even thought about that, consider solutions from other places. Well, I will tell you that I have heard this very thing, and it's one of the reasons why walking in the door, I felt like it was so important for me to get to know the place. So I've been doing a great deal of listening. I have met with huge numbers of people, both in small groups, individually, inside the institution, outside the institution. I've needed to set some early priorities, but I also think that it is absolutely essential that I listen carefully to what people see are the needs of the state of New Mexico, what people are hoping for, what they're expecting from the university, what we're doing well, what we're not. I'm doing a statewide listening tour because I believe that the modern flagship university absolutely must be attuned to the needs of the state. And so, I started the statewide tour yesterday with a trip to Los Alamos, and I went to the branch campus. I will be going to Gallup and Grants and the Zuni reservation on Monday and Tuesday, so that trip is planned. I'll be visiting the entire state throughout the summer. And what I hope is that I won't need to talk about, successes elsewhere, that part of this listening will allow me to figure out some potential solutions. I think they'll be suggested to me from the people that I meet, the range of people that I'll meet throughout this state tour.
In your previous roles in Missouri and Florida, you dealt with several crises, and you said in an interview you learned the necessity of having a good leadership team in place with clearly outlined responsibilities. How are you putting together such a team at UNM?
Well, I'm only 10 weeks in at this point, and there will be opportunities for some leadership transitions. Right now, we are doing a search for the head of University Council, so the leadership of our legal team is going to change. Certainly the area of finance and administration, David Harris has announced his plans to leave by the end of the year, and I'll be conducting a search there. The auditor will also be transitioning after this year, and there will be some naturally occurring vacancies where I'll have an opportunity to build a leadership team. We have some wonderful leaders in place, and I am spending a lot of time getting to know them, and I'm enjoying working with them. What I have to do is an assessment over time about what is going to be the best structure. I know that there are things I look for in leaders. I believe in transparency. I believe in integrity and demonstrating those qualities as leaders. So as I have an opportunity to fill, replacements, I'll be looking for leaders who have some of those qualities.
You also have said that universities need to better explain the transformational nature of education to communities outside the campus. How do you do that?
Oh, well, I think a starting point is actually to get out there and during the state listening tour, what I hope to be able to do is go into communities and talk about the many things that we might be doing as a university in the very communities where I am. So it really is about having the many examples of ways in which the institution has been doing things that are actually affecting quality of life throughout the state. And most of the time in my experience, it was certainly very much true in Missouri as well. We're a huge institution. We don't always know everything that we're doing, so one of the things I've had to do is try to get all that information. But when you go out into the state, you discover that people don't even realize that this particular thing that's going on is in fact from the University of New Mexico. So it's about being able to point out in every community, here are the things that a role that we have played in your community, whether it's educating these students and here's what their roles in your community today, whether it's something related to our healthcare system, there's just a variety of things that, you know, I think one can do in each and every community to try to convey the importance of a flagship university.
What has been your favorite thing so far about New Mexico since you got here?
Oh, the blue skies, the sunlight, the hiking, the green chili cheeseburgers, and just the warm welcome of the people of New Mexico for my arrival.
Well, President Garnett Stokes, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us.
Glad to do it. Thank you very much.